Welcome to another Bible study walkthrough. We left off talking about how Jesus calls them brothers, them being those of faith. And if you haven't already watched that Bible study walkthrough, you can check that out in our Hebrews playlist or linked in the description below. And you don't have to have watched that to really learn how to study the Bible with us today. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll know how to read and study the Bible better. That's the goal. We're in Hebrews chapter 2, starting in verse 12. Right after the author says, that is why he's not ashamed to call them brothers. You know what? I just realized something. Right here becomes an explanation. Now, if you remember, and even if you didn't watch it, that's fine. In the last episode, we talked about how Jesus, the one who sanctifies, and those who are sanctified all have one source, that being the Father. Then this phrase right here is very important as Bible students to recognize. He's almost giving you insight into the reason. He's literally saying that is why he's not ashamed to call them brothers. So we go, well, why is Jesus not ashamed to call us brothers, children of God alongside of him, in his family? Why is he not ashamed? Well, it actually involves us being sanctified. It involves him being perfected through suffering. Those are, he's explaining why. So now we get to verse 12. And it says, and these quotes let you know that the author's quoting an Old Testament passage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my purple pen and I'm going to draw a square around it so you know, this is a quotation from the Old Testament. And I don't remember where specifically. Let me know in the comments because I don't remember. But whatever he's about to say here in quoting the Old Testament, when you read the Bible and you notice, hey, he's quoting something, ask yourself why he's quoting that by reading the surrounding verses and continuing to read the rest of the chapter. Go to the original, quotation. If this was from Psalm chapter 10, which I don't believe it is, I would go to Psalm 10 and I'd read that all the way through. And then hopefully that will help me understand why the author is choosing this text of Scripture to support a point he's making. Right? So he just said, that's why he's not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, meaning this quotation from the Old Testament is going to support the idea that Jesus is not ashamed to call us brothers and sisters, children of God. He says, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children God has given me. Right? So what we have here is a continuing thought, a continuing point being made by three supporting scriptures. So we have quotation number 1, right? We have quotation number 2, right here. And when you see something like this, where something is done in repetition or consecutively, like for instance, 3 Old Testament passages are quoted in a row, you want to take note of that and go, why? And how do they connect? What is the point that each of these verses, support or make? Well, we remember he's making the point that Jesus is not ashamed to call us brothers and sisters, and then he'll quote, I will tell of your name to my brothers. So what I want to do is highlight that because you're probably wondering, why would I highlight that? Because of the fact that this is just a repeating word that helps me keep track of, what's going on. This word brothers becomes a repeating word. It's used twice in the same, little section. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. And I highlighted this in orange twice to hopefully help you recognize that when you see the word and or again, it's letting you know, I'm letting you know I'm repeating something on purpose. I'm making a point again by quoting another passage, or I'm making the same point again for the third time by quoting another passage. So take note of that when you read the Bible, when the authors or the one speaking is letting you in on why they're saying something, and they're trying to almost lay out the breadcrumbs for you to follow. So again, I will put my trust in him wherever that quotation comes from, which off the top of my head, I don't remember. It's going to support the idea, again, that Jesus is not ashamed to call us really fellow children of God. And same with this verse, behold, I and the children God has given me, right? So, I just want to highlight the children there because that relates to the idea of the brothers being put up here. So this is not exactly the same word used, but it is the same concept emphasizing the same idea. Brothers here emphasizes family, fellow, belonging to the same family, as does this phrase, the children. So when you read the Bible, do take note of repeating words, but also take note of any other words or ideas that are synonymous or emphasize the same thing, right? So it's on us to go back and go, hey, how do these verses truly support the idea that Jesus is not ashamed to call us brothers as it relates to what he's done for us? It's on us to think through these things. So let me know in the comments what you guys think. Why did the author choose these verses? Something you can do when you're answering a question like that is to go back to the Old Testament, read this passage in its entirety, read this passage, and read the surrounding ideas, read that whole chapter, and then come back here and think about how, the author is using those verses to support an idea, because it's not just the quotation he uses, it's actually what surrounds this in its original context that's also going to support his idea. So for instance, if this was Psalm chapter 10, you know what? Instead of guessing, let's just pull it up and see where this comes from, because I don't want to guess. Tired of guessing. Okay, this comes from Isaiah or Psalm chapter 18, verse 2. Psalm 18, verse 2, from what I can gather. Or maybe it's Isaiah 8:17. I'll wait for those. There's a number. Actually, no, it's Isaiah 8:18 right here. Let's just work with this one because it's easier. Isaiah 8:18. So I would go to Isaiah, read verse 18 in context, but I'd also read the first 17 verses that come before it. I'd read Isaiah 8, 1 through 17. And then after that, I'd read the rest of Isaiah 8. And then hopefully, as I read it as one unit, that passage will bring clarity as to why the author is using this verse. Behold, I am the children God has given me. So God here is referenced, that's something worth noting. Well, who's the I? Who's the I? Well, remember, Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers. So essentially, he's going to be speaking in these passages. Jesus is the one saying, I and the children God has given me. And we'll go back, and I want to explain what I'm doing here. And then in verse 13, this is Jesus essentially saying, I'll put my trust in who? Well, the only one worthy of our trust is God, the Father, right? Or in verse 12, he says, I will tell of your name. Whose name is he telling of? Well, the name of God. To my brothers in the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. So notice there's two things in every one of these verses, and this is what we do. When you see a list, in this context, there's a list of Old Testament verses being used to support one main idea. Okay, so I want to take note of that. Sometimes you'll see a list of adjectives, or a list of characteristics, or a list of events, or a list of people. And what you want to do is think about, what do these ideas in this list have in common? Item number 1, item number 2, item number 3. What do they have in common? Well, each of them is making the same point. Each of them has Jesus speaking as the I, right? Each of them has, something about God the Father being referenced, his name, his praise, putting trust in him, right? God giving the children to Jesus, that kind of thing, right? So it's on me to meditate through that and go, that's interesting that they all have that in common. Now, what do those things tell me or emphasize about this verse or this verse? So for example, what I would do is go, the main point of this is that Jesus is not ashamed to call us brothers because we've been sanctified since he was made perfect through suffering, right? He's the founder of our salvation. He was made perfect through suffering. And through that sacrificial death, we're able to be sanctified. That's why he's not ashamed to call us brothers. So how does this verse and the concept of God's name being proclaimed, or the concept of God's praises being sung, how does that relate to us being sanctified and God sanctifying us through the suffering of his Son, who was made perfect, right? Or in verse 13, of all the verses the author could have quoted, he specifically quotes putting trust in the Father. What does that have to do with the ideas I've already seen put forth, of Jesus being perfected through suffering, of us being sanctified because Jesus sanctifies us and calls us brothers, right? For some reason, the author chose to quote this verse, I will put my trust in him, or at least, it comes from a collection of verses, almost like a compilation. But either way, of all the things he could have said, why is he emphasizing putting trust in God? Or here, God giving the children to him? Why those specific ideas, and how do they relate to the main points at hand, such as Jesus being greater than angels, or us having a great salvation we should not neglect, right? Each of these quotes is going to emphasize a main point, but also there's going to be subpoints. So when you read the Bible, take note of that. Meditate on the scripture. Don't speed through it. Some of you guys read the Bible a little too fast. And so sometimes it's good if you've never read a book before, you're going to read through Hebrews quickly to get more of just a big picture, right? But go back and read it slow enough to meditate on how ideas connect, and how, this is telling one or emphasizing one big point, that Jesus is better than angels. By the way, we're able to be called children of God with him, right? And so why did he quote this verse? Of all the verses, he chooses to, he intentionally picks this verse, which according to my cross-reference is Psalm 22:22, right? So I'd go back to Psalm 22. Think about how Jesus here is telling the name of God to his brothers, and in the midst of his family, really, and those who love God, he's singing the praises of God. Why this verse? Think about the praise and the name of God being proclaimed, and how that relates to us being sanctified, and him being perfected through suffering, and all those ideas. We just want to think about this, but also pay attention to any repeating ideas. For instance, have I seen the concept of children, or the concept of trusting in God so far up to this point in Hebrews? If I read back through chapter 1 and through the rest of chapter 2, will I see anything about trusting God? Will I see anything about the name of God? Will I see anything about the children, that God gives to Jesus? And you'll be surprised. You might see those ideas earlier and go, wow, I didn't see that before. Good thing I took the time to go backtrack a little bit, and see if, those ideas were already put forth. And sometimes you'll see that. And what will happen is, if I've already seen, let's say in Hebrews 1, I see God giving children to the Son as a gift of his grace. Well, then that will help me understand better what it means here. It's almost like the author is painting a picture and building out this idea for you to see. So in the next Bible study walkthrough, we'll get to verse 14. But, in the comments, let me know what you think about these verses as they relate to each other, the similarities they have. And then when you find a similarity, such as Jesus is referenced and something about the Father is referenced in each of these verses, think about how those ideas connect to the main things that came before it, right? So go read verse 10 through 11, and then, think about that. What's the main point being put forth there? And then relate that to these quotations from the Old Testament. All right. Again, we have a completely free Bible study course linked in the description below. If you want to take a 40-day Bible study course, we have a 27-day, we have an 11-day program. It's completely up to you. It's self-paced. It will take you deep into learning how to read the Bible. And hopefully you'll have your skills developed, or you'll gain new skills along the way. All right. And then you can always visit abovereproachministry.com to check out all the other free resources we have and all the other stuff we got going on. But I will see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. All right.